In a Houston garage, a 68-year-old widow was about to face her children's intervention. What started as carburetor work took a shocking turn when they demanded she sell her junk. Amanda Smith wasn't your typical librarian. For decades, she had restored vintage cars with her late husband, known for her automotive expertise. When her children arrived with senior living brochures, she had no idea they were walking into a financial crisis. Amanda's refusal would lead to discovering her collection's true worth. What began as family pressure would become salvation. The Smiths would never be the same after learning Mom's worthless cars were worth $500,000. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Amanda Smith's weathered hands moved with practiced precision around the Shelby's engine bay, her fingers finding the carburetor float chamber without conscious thought. 47 years of working on engines had made such movements second nature, muscle memory, that connected her to thousands of quiet mornings like this one. The Houston humidity had already begun its daily assault, but here in her garage sanctuary, surrounded by the familiar scent of motor oil and leather, she felt the peace that had sustained her through 5 years of widowhood. The 1967 Shelby GT500 gleamed under the fluorescent lights, its Wimbledon white paint reflecting decades of careful attention. She and Robert had spent 3 years restoring this particular beauty, working side by side in this very garage while their children grew up around them. Every bolt, every gasket, every carefully sourced part held memories of shared Saturday mornings, and Robert's patient voice explaining the intricacies of Ford's racing heritage. "Just a minor adjustment," she murmured to herself, her voice carrying the authority of someone who understood machinery better than most mechanics half her age. The float had been sticking slightly during yesterday's drive, nothing dangerous, but not the perfection Robert would have tolerated. Amanda never tolerated anything less than what Robert would have expected. The sound of car doors slamming in her driveway interrupted her concentration. Amanda glanced at her watch, 9:30 on a Saturday morning. Too early for casual visitors, too coordinated to be coincidental. Through the garage's side window, she watched her 3 adult children emerge from David's pristine BMW, like a delegation preparing for negotiation. David led the group, his shoulders set with the same determination he'd carried into every challenge since childhood. At 42, her eldest son possessed the commanding presence that served him well as a cardiologist, but Amanda recognized the particular set of his jaw that meant he'd already decided the outcome of whatever conversation they were about to have. Jennifer followed, clutching a manila folder with the efficiency that had made her one of Houston's most sought-after corporate lawyers. Even on weekends, Amanda's only daughter dressed for success, her appearance calculated to project authority and competence. The lawyer and Jennifer rarely took breaks. Brian brought up the rear, his artist's eye already cataloging the vintage automobiles visible through the open garage door. At 35, her youngest still carried himself with the slight uncertainty of someone who'd spent years disappointing family expectations before finally finding his own path. But Amanda noticed how his gaze lingered on the cars with something approaching respect. Unlike his siblings, Brian had inherited Robert's appreciation for craftsmanship. "Morning, Mom," David called out, his voice carrying the forced cheer of someone delivering unpleasant news. "Hope we're not interrupting anything important." Amanda straightened slowly, wiping her hands on a shop rag that had seen countless similar moments. "Just working on the Shelby's carburetor. Nothing that can't wait." She studied their faces, noting the way Jennifer and David exchanged glances while Brian focused intently on the collection surrounding them. "Though I suspect whatever brings all 3 of you here at once might be more urgent than a sticking float." Jennifer stepped forward, her diplomatic training evident in the careful arrangement of her features. "We wanted to talk with you about some concerns we've been discussing. As a family." "Concerns?" Amanda's tone remained neutral, but her posture shifted slightly, a subtle straightening that anyone who'd known her for decades would recognize as a defensive preparation. "About what, specifically?" David moved closer, his hands clasped behind his back in the pose he'd perfected during medical school presentations. "About this place, Mom. About how you're living." About whether it's time to consider some changes that might be better for everyone. The garage fell silent except for the distant hum of the old refrigerator in the corner and the soft, settling sounds of cooling metal. Amanda's gaze moved deliberately from one child to another, reading the rehearsed nature of their positioning, the way they'd clearly discussed strategy before arriving. Changes, she repeated, her voice carrying the same measured quality she'd used during 35 years of managing difficult library patrons. What sort of changes did you have in mind? Jennifer opened her folder, revealing glossy brochures that caught the fluorescent light. We've been researching some wonderful senior living communities. Places where you could have your own apartment, but also access to activities, social opportunities, medical care if needed. Jennifer followed, clutching a manila folder with the efficiency that had made her one of Houston's most sought-after corporate lawyers. Even on weekends, Amanda's only daughter dressed for success, her appearance calculated to project authority and competence. The lawyer in Jennifer rarely took breaks. Brian brought up the rear, his artist's eye already cataloging the vintage automobiles visible through the open garage door. At 35, her youngest still carried himself with the slight uncertainty of someone who'd spent years disappointing family expectations before finally finding his own path. But Amanda noticed how his gaze lingered on the cars with something approaching respect. Unlike his siblings, Brian had inherited Robert's appreciation for craftsmanship. "Morning, Mom," David called out, his voice carrying the forced cheer of someone delivering unpleasant news. "Hope we're not interrupting anything important." Amanda straightened slowly, wiping her hands on a shop rag that had seen countless similar moments. "Just working on the Shelby's carburetor. Nothing that can't wait." She studied their faces, noting the way Jennifer and David exchanged glances, while Brian focused intently on the collection surrounding them. "Though I suspect whatever brings all three of you here at once might be more urgent than a sticking float." Jennifer stepped forward, her diplomatic training evident in the careful arrangement of her features. "We wanted to talk with you about some concerns we've been discussing, as a family." Concerns. Amanda's tone remained neutral, but her posture shifted slightly, a subtle straightening that anyone who'd known her for decades would recognize as a defensive preparation. "About what, specifically?" David moved closer, his hands clasped behind his back in the pose he'd perfected during medical school presentations. "About this place, Mom. About how you're living. About whether it's time to consider some changes that might be better for everyone." The garage fell silent except for the distant hum of the old refrigerator in the corner and the soft, settling sounds of cooling metal. Amanda's gaze moved deliberately from one child to another, reading the rehearsed nature of their positioning, the way they'd clearly discussed strategy before arriving. "Changes," she repeated, her voice carrying the same measured quality she'd used during 35 years of managing difficult library patrons. "What sort of changes did you have in mind?" Jennifer opened her folder, revealing glossy brochures that caught the fluorescent light. "We've been researching some wonderful senior living communities. Places where you could have your own apartment, but also access to activities, social opportunities, medical care if needed. Places where you wouldn't have to worry about maintaining all this." David gestured broadly at the garage and its contents, his expression suggesting he was discussing the disposal of junk rather than a carefully curated collection. "This house is too big for one person, Mom. These cars require constant attention and expense. You're 68 years old. You shouldn't be crawling around under engines anymore." Brian shifted uncomfortably, his eyes still focused on the vehicles surrounding them. Amanda noticed how his gaze paused on each car, taking in details his siblings missed. The perfect alignment of the chrome, the subtle variations in paint that spoke to different eras of automotive design, the obvious care that had preserved these machines far beyond their expected lifespans. "I see." Amanda's response carried no emotion, but her hands stilled completely on the shop rag. And this decision was reached through family discussion, without including the family member most affected by it. Jennifer's diplomatic training kicked in immediately. "Mom, we're not making decisions for you. We're expressing concern about your well-being. About whether isolating yourself here with these projects is preventing you from moving forward with your life." Moving forward. The phrase hung in the air like exhaust fumes. Amanda set down her tools with deliberate precision, each movement controlled and purposeful. Interesting choice of words. Moving forward from what, exactly? David's patience began showing its limits. From Dad's death, Mom, it's been 5 years. These cars, this garage, it's like a shrine to the past. You're living in a museum instead of engaging with the present. The accusation landed with the force David had intended, but Amanda's reaction wasn't what he'd expected. Instead of defensiveness or hurt, her expression settled into something far more dangerous, the calm that Robert had learned to recognize as the precursor to Amanda's rare but memorable displays of temper. "A shrine," she said quietly. "A museum." Her gaze moved slowly across the garage, taking in the 1969 Mustang Boss 429 that had been Robert's first major restoration, the pristine 1970 Plymouth Cuda that had taken them 2 years to track down, the small fleet of carefully maintained classics that represented not just automotive history, but the history of their marriage. "Is that what you see when you look at 40 years of shared passion?" Brian finally spoke, his voice softer than his siblings. "Mom, we know how much these cars meant to you and Dad, but maybe it's time to let someone else enjoy them. Someone who could give them the attention they deserve while you focus on other things." Other things. Amanda's tone remained conversational, but something in her posture suggested a line had been crossed. "Such as what, Brian? Bingo games and craft circles? Supervised medication schedules and communal dining rooms?" Jennifer tried to regain control of the conversation. "The communities we've researched offer much more than that. Educational programs, travel opportunities, social engagement with people your own age." "People my own age," Amanda interrupted, her voice carrying an edge that made all 3 children pause. "You mean people who've given up on everything that made their lives meaningful? People who've surrendered their independence and their passions because their children decided it was time?" Quote. David's medical training had taught him to recognize when a patient was becoming agitated, and he attempted to use his professional tone to diffuse the situation. "Mom, we're trying to help you see that clinging to the past isn't healthy. Dad's gone. These cars can't bring him back." The garage fell completely silent. Amanda's hands stopped moving entirely, and for a moment, the only sound was the distant rumble of traffic on Heights Boulevard. When she finally responded, her voice carried a quality none of her children had heard since they were young, the tone she'd used when they'd pushed too far and discovered the limits of her patience. "You think I don't know Robert is gone?" The question emerged with surgical precision. "You think I work on these engines because I'm delusional? Because I'm some doddering old woman who can't face reality?" "That's not what we meant," Jennifer began, but Amanda continued as if she hadn't spoken. "I know exactly where your father is. I was there when the cancer took him, piece by piece, while he worried more about what would happen to me than about his own pain. I held his hand when he made me promise to keep living, not just existing." Her voice strengthened with each word. "These cars aren't a shrine to death. They're a celebration of life, of partnership, of the joy we found in creating something beautiful together." David's frustration erupted. "But that's exactly the problem. You're so focused on celebrating the past that you've stopped participating in the present. When's the last time you went anywhere besides car shows? When's the last time you made a new friend, tried a new experience, did anything that wasn't connected to these machines? When's the last time any of you visited me for a reason other than trying to change me?" Amanda's counter-question carried the weight of 5 years of accumulated disappointment. "When's the last time you asked about my work, my interests, my thoughts on anything beyond whether I'm taking my medications and eating regular meals?" The accusation hit its mark. Jennifer looked away first, recognizing the truth in her mother's words. Brian continued studying the cars with newfound intensity, while David's jaw tightened as he prepared to press his advantage. "That's unfair, Mom. We visit. We call. We care about your well-being." "You care about your idea of my well-being," Amanda corrected. "You care about whether I fit your image of how a 68-year-old widow should behave, whether I'm convenient and contained and safely managed." She moved to the Shelby's driver door, resting her hand on the pristine chrome handle. "But caring about someone means respecting who they are, not trying to reshape them into who you think they should become. Jennifer made one final attempt at diplomacy. Mom, we're not trying to reshape you. We're trying to help you see opportunities for happiness that you might be missing. Happiness. Amanda's smile held no warmth. You want to know what makes me happy? Working with my hands on something beautiful and complex. Preserving history and craftsmanship. Maintaining Robert's legacy and my own. Living independently in the home we chose together. Surrounded by the projects that represent our shared dreams. Her gaze moved from one child to another, none of which requires your approval or your management. David's professional composure finally cracked. Your shared dreams are in the past, Mom. Dad's dead, and you're wasting your life maintaining monuments to a relationship that's over. The words hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Brian actually stepped backward, his face reflecting shock at his brother's cruelty. Jennifer's diplomatic mask slipped completely, revealing genuine distress at how far the conversation had deteriorated. Amanda's response came quietly, but with the finality of a closing door. Get out. Mom, Jennifer started. Get out of my garage, get out of my house. Get out of my life until you can remember that I'm your mother, not your patient or your project or your problem to be solved. David's anger matched hers now. Fine, but when you fall off a ladder working on one of these relics, or when you can't afford the property taxes because you've spent your retirement on spare parts, don't expect us to come running. I wouldn't dream of it, Amanda replied, her voice steady as granite. I've been taking care of myself and these relics for 5 years without your help. I suspect I can manage a bit longer. The 3 siblings left as they'd arrived, as a unit, but now a fractured one. Jennifer lingered at the garage entrance, clearly wanting to say something conciliatory, but David's decisive stride toward his BMW pulled her along. Brian cast one last look at the collection, his expression mixing regret with something that might have been respect. Amanda stood motionless until the sound of the BMW's engine faded into the neighborhood's Saturday morning quiet. Only then did she allow her shoulders to sag slightly, the adrenaline of confrontation giving way to the familiar ache of family disappointment. She returned to the Shelby's engine bay, picking up her tools with hands that trembled almost imperceptibly. The carburetor still needed adjustment, and the afternoon was growing warm. There was work to be done, as there had been for 47 years. As there would be tomorrow, and the day after that, regardless of what her children thought about the value of preservation, passion, and the complex mathematics of love that transcended death. The garage settled back into its peaceful rhythm, but something had changed. The confrontation had drawn lines that couldn't be easily erased, forcing acknowledgments that couldn't be taken back. Amanda worked on, her movements steady and sure, but her mind was already calculating the cost of independence and wondering if love could survive the collision between memory and expectation. Amanda's hands moved with practiced precision around the Shelby's carburetor, but her mind remained fixed on David's parting words. The familiar weight of her socket wrench provided comfort as she adjusted the float mechanism, muscle memory carrying her through motions she'd performed thousands of times before. The silence felt different now, heavier somehow, charged with the echoes of accusations and ultimatums. She worked methodically, finding peace in the complexity of mechanical systems that responded to logic rather than emotion. Unlike children, carburetors could be fixed. Her fingers traced the chrome air cleaner housing, and suddenly she was 19 again, watching Robert's gentle hands guide hers as they rebuilt the engine of his first car, a beat-up 1965 Mustang that would become the foundation of everything they'd build together. Feel how the spring tension should be, his voice whispered across 5 decades. Not too tight, not too loose, everything in balance. Amanda paused, remembering how Robert's patience had never wavered, whether teaching her about compression ratios or helping her navigate the complexities of raising 3 strong-willed children. He'd understood that restoration wasn't about erasing history. It was about honoring it while preparing for the future. She opened the Shelby's glove compartment, retrieving a leather-bound notebook she'd discovered only weeks after Robert's funeral. His careful handwriting filled every page, detailed restoration plans for projects they'd never completed, sketches of modifications they'd discussed during long Saturday afternoons, notes about parts suppliers, and fellow enthusiasts who shared their passion. Phase 3, 1970 Boss 302 Rebuild, she read aloud, her voice catching slightly. Amanda thinks we should focus on originality rather than performance modifications. As usual, she's right. The notebook revealed dreams they'd never had time to pursue, conversations she'd forgotten in the haze of grief and recovery. Robert had planned years ahead, always assuming they'd have more time, more Saturday mornings, more shared discoveries in dusty barn finds and swap meet treasures. The sound of footsteps on gravel interrupted her reverie. Maggie Thompson appeared in the garage doorway, carrying 2 steaming coffee cups and wearing the concerned expression of someone who'd witnessed the earlier confrontation from her adjacent property. "Thought you might need this," Maggie said, offering coffee while studying Amanda's face for signs of distress. Sounded like quite the family meeting. Amanda accepted the cup gratefully, inhaling the familiar aroma that had sustained countless restoration sessions. "They want me to sell everything. Move to some managed community where I can pursue age-appropriate hobbies like needlepoint and water aerobics." Maggie's weathered face reflected decades of fighting similar battles in a male-dominated industry. Kids think they know what's best. Usually means what's most convenient for them. They see junk where Robert and I saw history, machinery where we saw artistry. Amanda's gaze moved across her collection, each vehicle representing not just automotive evolution but the evolution of her marriage. They can't understand that letting go would be the real death. David Smith sat in his office overlooking the Houston Medical Center, staring at documents that might as well have been his professional death warrant. The forensic accountant's report lay spread across his mahogany desk, like evidence at a crime scene. Pages of figures that detailed how thoroughly his business partner Marcus had destroyed everything David had spent 15 years building. "The embezzlement goes back at least 3 years, his lawyer had explained that morning. Possibly longer. He was sophisticated about it, small amounts at first, then larger chunks as he got more confident. Your malpractice insurance premiums, equipment leases, employee salaries, he skimmed from everything." David's hands trembled slightly as he reviewed the spreadsheet columns. $700,000. Gone. Vanished into Marcus's gambling addiction and cocaine habit, leaving behind a practice drowning in debt and a reputation that might never recover. The medical board had already begun their investigation. Patients were asking questions. Creditors were circling like vultures. His phone buzzed with another call from the bank. David let it go to voicemail, knowing it would join the dozen others he hadn't returned. Each message brought worse news: frozen accounts, called loans, threats of foreclosure on both his practice and his River Oaks home. The irony wasn't lost on him. This morning he'd lectured his mother about living in denial, about facing reality and making responsible choices. Now he sat surrounded by the wreckage of his own supposedly responsible life, watching everything he'd worked for crumble because he'd trusted the wrong person. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Through his office window, David could see the gleaming towers of the medical center where he'd trained, where he'd built his reputation one patient at a time. The view that once filled him with pride now mocked his helplessness. In 48 hours, he might lose his medical license. In a week, he could be facing criminal charges as an accessory to fraud. His pride had always been his strength, the driving force that carried him through medical school, residency, and the early years of building his practice. But pride was also preventing him from picking up the phone and calling the one person who might understand what it felt like to watch a life's work disappear. The same person he'd just told to abandon her own life's work that morning. Across town in River Oaks, Jennifer Smith Williams paced her modern kitchen while juggling phone calls that could reshape her future. The promotion offer had come at the worst possible time. Senior partner at a prestigious New York firm, specializing in international corporate law. Everything she'd worked toward since law school. "The position requires relocation by the end of the month," her colleague explained through the phone. "They need an answer by Friday." Jennifer ended the call and stared at her reflection in the kitchen's stainless steel appliances. At 39, she'd built her career on careful planning and strategic thinking. Every decision calculated for maximum advancement. every relationship evaluated for professional benefit. The New York opportunity represented the pinnacle of everything she'd sacrificed for. But David's behavior that morning troubled her more than she wanted to admit. His aggression toward their mother had seemed desperate rather than concerned, driven by something beyond family worry. Jennifer's legal training had taught her to recognize when people were hiding crucial information, and her brother was definitely hiding something. Her phone buzzed with a text from her assistant. "Henderson Industries wants to move their merger timeline up. Need your decision on the New York position to plan strategy." The professional side of Jennifer's brain calculated the costs of delay, other candidates, lost opportunities, the perception of indecision in a field that rewarded quick thinking. But the daughter in her remembered her mother's face as they delivered their ultimatum, the way Amanda's shoulders had straightened with familiar defiance. Jennifer had inherited her mother's stubbornness, though she'd channeled it into boardroom negotiations rather than carburetor adjustments. Now that same trait was making her question whether their intervention had been about Amanda's welfare or their own discomfort with choices they didn't understand. In his Montrose art studio, Brian Smith stepped back from the sculpture that had been consuming his attention for weeks. What had started as an abstract exploration of family dynamics had evolved into something more specific, a twisted amalgamation of gears, pistons, and human figures that seemed to be pulling apart despite their mechanical connections. Brian hadn't planned the automotive themes. They'd emerged organically as he worked, his subconscious processing the tension between his mother's passion and his siblings' disapproval. The sculpture captured something he couldn't articulate in words, the way families could share the same components but function in completely different ways. His phone rang. Jennifer's name appeared on the screen. "We need to talk about David," she said without preamble. "Something's wrong. His behavior this morning wasn't just about Mom." Brian set down his tools, unsurprised. As the family's emotional barometer, he'd sensed undercurrents beneath David's aggressive push for change. "What kind of wrong? I don't know yet. But I've been thinking about what Mom said, about us only visiting when we want to change her. When's the last time any of us actually listened to her?" The question hung between them. Brian looked at his sculpture, seeing it suddenly through different eyes. The mechanical figures weren't just pulling apart. They were also trying to connect, gears searching for alignment despite the forces trying to separate them. "Maybe," he said slowly, "we've been so focused on fixing everyone else that we haven't noticed what's breaking in ourselves." The sound of a well-tuned V8 engine rumbling up Amanda's driveway announced Chuck Patterson's arrival before she saw his pristine 1969 Camaro SS emerge through the morning heat shimmer. Amanda wiped her hands on her shop rag and stepped out of the garage, immediately recognizing the deliberate way Chuck shut off the engine, the precise timing of someone who understood the mechanical poetry of classic automobiles. Chuck unfolded his tall frame from the Camaro with the careful movements of a 72-year-old who still insisted on driving cars without power steering. His silver hair was perfectly groomed despite the Houston humidity, and his polo shirt bore the subtle logo of the Gulf Coast Classic Car Association, credentials Amanda respected more than any business card. "Mrs. Smith," he said, extending a hand weathered by decades of working with tools despite his obvious wealth. "Chuck Patterson. Maggie Thompson said you might be willing to let an old gearhead admire your collection." Amanda studied his face, noting the genuine enthusiasm that lit up his eyes as his gaze swept across the visible portion of her garage. This wasn't the polite interest of someone making social conversation. This was the focused attention of a true enthusiast encountering something special. "Mr. Patterson, I know your reputation from the car shows. Your '67 Corvette L88 is legendary." Amanda gestured toward the garage. "Though I suspect Maggie told you more than just that I have a few old cars." Chuck's smile acknowledged the understatement. "She mentioned you and your late husband had assembled something remarkable. But seeing is believing in this business." As they entered the garage, Chuck's demeanor shifted into what Amanda recognized as collector mode, the careful, analytical appreciation of someone who understood both craftsmanship and value. His gaze moved methodically from vehicle to vehicle, pausing to study details that casual observers would miss. He stopped in front of the Shelby GT500, his breath catching slightly. "Good Lord, is this a genuine '67? Numbers matching, Amanda confirmed, feeling a familiar pride warm her chest. Robert and I found her in a barn outside Beaumont in 1987. Previous owner had no idea what he had, thought it was just another Mustang. Chuck circled the car slowly, his trained eye cataloging every detail. He knelt to examine the side pipes, ran his fingers along the hood's subtle curves, peered through the driver's window at the original interior. When he finally straightened, his expression held the reverence Amanda had learned to recognize in serious collectors. "Mrs. Smith, I've been collecting for 30 years. I've seen restorations that cost more than houses, and I've seen original survivors that museums would kill for." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "This is possibly the finest example of a 67 GT500 I've ever encountered. The restoration quality is museum grade, but more than that, it's been maintained with love. You can feel it." Amanda's throat tightened unexpectedly. Robert always said cars had souls, that our job wasn't to restore them, but to help them remember who they were meant to be. He was a wise man. Chuck continued his examination, noting details that spoke to the depth of Robert and Amanda's expertise. The paint depth is perfect. Original colors, but modern clear coat for protection. The engine bay shows they understood how to preserve originality while ensuring reliability. This isn't just a restoration. It's a masterpiece. They spent the next hour discussing the technical aspects of the collection. Chuck's knowledge matched Amanda's own, and she found herself relaxing into the kind of conversation she hadn't enjoyed since Robert's death. Here was someone who understood why preserving automotive history mattered, who could appreciate the hundreds of hours invested in tracking down correct date-coded parts and period-appropriate modifications. "If you don't mind me asking," Chuck said as they paused beside the Shelby, "have you ever considered what this collection might be worth?" "From an insurance perspective, of course." Amanda had avoided that calculation for years, focusing on emotional rather than monetary value. "Robert always said we weren't collecting investments. We were preserving history." Noble sentiment, and I agree completely. But history this well preserved has significant market value. Chuck's tone remained respectful, but his words carried weight. The Shelby alone, given its condition, documentation, and restoration quality, would easily bring $500,000 at auction, possibly more to the right private collector. The figure hit Amanda like a physical blow. $500,000 for one car, the same car her children had dismissed as expensive junk that morning, part of an obsession preventing her from living responsibly. Chuck continued, seemingly unaware of the impact of his words. "The 69 Boss 429, the 70 CUDA, the rest of the collection, conservatively, you're looking at over $1 million in assets. More importantly, you're looking at automotive history that deserves to be seen and appreciated, not hidden away." Amanda's mind reeled. $1 million. She thought of David's dismissive gestures, Jennifer's pamphlets for senior living communities, Brian's apologetic silence. They treated her collection like an expensive hobby that needed to be abandoned, never suspecting they were discussing what amounted to a small fortune. "I should mention," Chuck said carefully, "if you ever considered allowing any of these vehicles to find new homes, I'd be honored to be considered. Not as a businessman, but as someone who would ensure they receive the care and recognition they deserve. I show at Pebble Beach, Amelia Island, venues where Robert's work would be celebrated." Amanda nodded slowly, her thoughts spinning. That's generous of you to consider." "More than consider. If you were ever interested in discussing the Shelby specifically, I'd be prepared to make a serious offer. Cash purchase, with the understanding that Robert's restoration work would be properly credited and documented." After Chuck left, Amanda sat alone in the garage, his business card trembling in her fingers. The familiar sanctuary suddenly felt different, charged with possibilities she'd never allowed herself to consider. Her children's morning ultimatum took on new dimensions as she contemplated the irony of their assumptions. They wanted her to sell her junk and move somewhere more appropriate for a woman her age. They had no idea that her junk could solve problems they couldn't imagine if she chose to let it. But choice, Amanda realized, was something her children had never considered giving her. They'd arrived with decisions already made, solutions already planned, futures already determined. The question now was whether the value Chuck had revealed would change their perspective, or whether it would simply provide new ammunition for their arguments about responsible behavior and age-appropriate choices. Amanda picked up her phone to call Jennifer, then hesitated. Something told her this information was too powerful to share casually. The knowledge of her collection's true worth was a weapon that could reshape family dynamics in unpredictable ways. For now, she decided, it would remain her secret. But secrets, like classic cars, had a way of revealing their true value when the timing was right. David's hands shook as he set down the phone, the medical board's ultimatum echoing in his ears like a death sentence. 48 hours. 48 hours to settle $700,000 in fraudulent debt, or face suspension of his medical license pending criminal investigation. The board's tone had been clinical, professional, the same detached courtesy he'd used countless times when delivering devastating diagnoses to patients. The irony wasn't lost on him. This morning he'd stood in his mother's garage lecturing her about facing reality, about making responsible choices and moving forward with life. Now he sat in his office watching his own carefully constructed reality crumble around him like a house built on sand. Marcus had been more than a business partner. He'd been David's closest friend since residency, the best man at his wedding, godfather to his daughter. The betrayal cut deeper than the financial devastation. Every shared meal, every professional celebration, every moment of trust had been contaminated by Marcus's addiction and lies. David's computer screen displayed his bank account balance, $23,847.52. 3 weeks ago, that number had been comfortable, supported by practice revenues and investment accounts that no longer existed. Marcus had been systematic in his theft, careful to maintain the illusion of prosperity while gutting the foundation of everything David had built. The door to his office opened without a knock, his receptionist's way of warning him that whoever was entering wouldn't take no for an answer. 2 men in cheap suits stepped inside, their presence filling the room with the particular tension that accompanies official bad news. Dr. Smith, Agent Rodriguez, FBI Financial Crimes Division. Agent Chen. Rodriguez's badge glinted under the fluorescent lights. We need to discuss your relationship with Dr. Marcus Kellerman. David's mouth went dry. The FBI. He'd known this moment was coming since the accountants had revealed the scope of Marcus's fraud. But facing federal agents transformed abstract fear into visceral terror. I've already spoken with my attorneys, David managed, his voice steady despite the panic clawing at his chest. I had no knowledge of Dr. Kellerman's activities. Agent Chen consulted a tablet, his expression neutral. We're aware of your cooperation thus far. However, some irregularities in your financial records require clarification, specifically transfers that appear to have your electronic authorization. The room tilted slightly. David gripped his desk edge, fighting waves of nausea as the implications crashed over him. Marcus hadn't just stolen from the practice. He'd forged David's authorizations, making him appear complicit in the fraud. I never authorized those transfers, David said, but his voice lacked conviction. How could he prove negative knowledge? How could he demonstrate innocence when every electronic trail led back to his credentials, his accounts, his digital signature? Rodriguez leaned forward slightly. Dr. Smith, we understand you may have been manipulated. Dr. Kellerman was sophisticated in his methods. But the district attorney is under pressure to prosecute someone, and right now, you're the only available target. The message was clear. Cooperate completely or become the scapegoat for Marcus's crimes. David's medical training had taught him to remain calm under pressure, to think clearly in crisis situations. But this crisis threatened everything he'd worked for, everything that defined him as a person. After the agents left, David sat alone in his office as afternoon shadows lengthened across his desk. His daughter would start college in 2 years, tuition he could no longer afford. His wife had already begun asking uncomfortable questions about their financial situation. His patients trusted him with their lives, but that trust would evaporate the moment news of the FBI investigation became public. He thought about his mother's collection, about the dismissive way he'd gestured at her expensive junk that morning. The cars he'd mocked as obstacles to responsible living suddenly seemed like symbols of a different kind of responsibility, the obligation to preserve something meaningful, to maintain value across generations. David picked up his phone to call Amanda, then set it down again. His pride, the same pride that had driven him to medical school and sustained him through years of building his practice, now prevented him from admitting weakness to the mother he'd tried to manage that morning. Jennifer's phone buzzed insistently as she reviewed contracts in her downtown office, but she ignored it in favor of the document demanding her immediate attention. The Henderson Industries merger had accelerated unexpectedly, requiring her to make final decisions about the New York position, while simultaneously managing a deal worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Her assistant knocked and entered without waiting for permission, their agreed signal for genuine emergencies. "Jennifer, I've got David's office on line 3. They say it's urgent, something about FBI agents and financial investigations." The contract slipped from Jennifer's fingers as implications cascaded through her legal mind. FBI investigations meant federal crimes. Financial crimes meant fraud or embezzlement. David's aggressive behavior that morning suddenly made perfect sense. Not concern for their mother, but displaced anxiety about his own crisis. "Put the call through," she said, her voice automatically shifting into crisis management mode. David's receptionist sounded shaken. "Ms. Williams, Dr. Smith asked me to call his family. Federal agents were here asking questions about his business partner. There's been some kind of embezzlement, and they're treating Dr. Smith as a person of interest." Jennifer's legal training kicked in immediately. "Has he spoken to them without an attorney present?" "I don't know. He's been locked in his office since they left. He won't take calls, won't see patients. I'm supposed to cancel his afternoon appointments, but I don't know what to tell people." After ending the call, Jennifer stared out her office window at the Houston skyline, her mind racing through legal precedents and criminal procedures. Federal financial crimes investigations were serious business, careers destroyed, reputations ruined, prison sentences that lasted decades. If David was being targeted, he needed help immediately. But the New York opportunity complicated everything. The firm expected her decision by Friday, and delays could be interpreted as lack of commitment. She'd worked 15 years for this chance, sacrificed relationships and personal time to build the expertise that made her valuable. Her phone rang again. Brian's name appeared on the screen. "Jen, something's wrong with David. I just drove past his house, FBI cars in the driveway, neighbors watching from their yards. What the hell is going on?" Jennifer closed her eyes, feeling the weight of family responsibility settling around her shoulders like a familiar burden. Financial crimes investigation. His business partner apparently embezzled from their practice. Jesus, how bad. Bad enough for federal agents and criminal investigation. Bad enough that David might lose everything. Jennifer paused, calculating timelines and consequences. Bad enough that our intervention this morning suddenly looks like incredible timing, or incredible irony. Brian was quiet for a moment. "You mean the part where we told Mom to sell her worthless cars?" "I mean the part where we pressured her to abandon her life's work while David's life's work is collapsing from fraud." Jennifer's legal mind was already connecting dots, seeing patterns and possibilities that made her stomach clench with anxiety. "We need to tell Mom." "Do we? David might not want family knowing about the investigation. And Mom's dealing with our ultimatum from this morning." Jennifer struggled with competing loyalties and professional obligations. "Plus, I have decisions to make about my own career that can't wait for family drama to resolve." Brian's voice carried the same steady calm he used when critiquing her legal strategies. "Jen, when did we become the kind of family that keeps secrets to avoid inconvenience?" Quote, the question hit harder than Jennifer expected. She thought about her mother's face that morning, the way Amanda had straightened her shoulders and refused to be managed. She thought about David's desperate aggression, the way he'd attacked their mother's choices while his own world crumbled in secret. "I need to call Mom," Jennifer said finally. "David's going to need help, and she deserves to know what's happening." But as she reached for her phone, Jennifer hesitated. The conversation that morning had ended badly, with Amanda ordering them out of her house and her life. Calling now with news of David's crisis might seem manipulative, the family returning only when they needed something, which, Jennifer realized with uncomfortable clarity, was exactly what they were doing. Amanda was adjusting the Shelby's timing when her phone rang. Jennifer's name on the display made her pause. 2 calls from her children in one day was unprecedented, especially after their morning confrontation. "Hello, Jennifer? Mom, I need to tell you something about David. Something that explains his behavior this morning." Amanda set down her timing light, hearing the careful tone her daughter used when delivering bad news to clients. "What kind of something?" "FBI kind of something. Financial crimes investigation. His business partner embezzled from their practice, and David might be facing criminal charges." The garage fell silent except for the distant hum of air conditioning and the settling sounds of cooling metal. Amanda lowered herself onto her rolling stool, processing the information through the lens of the morning's confrontation. "How long has he known?" "I'm not sure, but it explains why he was so aggressive about the cars, about you selling everything and moving somewhere responsible." Jennifer's voice carried guilt and realization. He was projecting his own crisis onto your situation. Amanda thought about Chuck Patterson's visit, about the $500,000 valuation that her children couldn't imagine. The irony was staggering. David facing financial ruin while lecturing his mother about the worthlessness of her collection. How bad is it, Jennifer? Potentially catastrophic. Federal investigations don't go away quietly. Even if he's cleared of criminal charges, the publicity alone could destroy his practice. Amanda closed her eyes, seeing David as a 10-year-old boy carefully organizing his tools in the garage, determined to help his father with restoration projects. The same perfectionism that had driven him to medical success had made him vulnerable to betrayal by someone he trusted. What does he need? Jennifer's relief was audible. Legal help, financial help, family support. In that order. "And what do you need, Jennifer? You didn't call just to inform me about David's problems." Her daughter's pause spoke volumes. "I got offered a partnership in New York. Senior level, international corporate law. Everything I've worked toward. Congratulations. When do you start?" That's the problem. They need an answer by Friday. And with David's situation. Jennifer's voice trailed off, the conflict obvious. Amanda understood immediately. Her daughter faced the same choice between family obligation and personal ambition that had shaped generations of women's lives. But unlike previous generations, Jennifer had real power to help. Legal expertise, professional connections, financial resources. "Jennifer, let me ask you something. This morning you told me I was living in the past, that I needed to move forward with my life. What did you mean by that?" I meant that clinging to memories wasn't healthy. That you should focus on new experiences instead of preserving old ones." "I see. And now you're faced with choosing between your future and your family's past. How do you plan to move forward?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Amanda could hear her daughter's breathing, the soft sounds of someone grappling with competing responsibilities and desires. "I don't know, Mom. I really don't know." For the first time since her children's arrival that morning, Amanda smiled. "Well, Jennifer, that's the first honest thing any of you have said to me today. Maybe we're finally ready to have a real conversation about what it means to preserve what matters while building toward the future." Jennifer sat in her car outside Amanda's house for 10 minutes before gathering the courage to walk to the front door. The evening heat still radiated from the concrete, but she barely noticed as her mind rehearsed conversations that might salvage what remained of her family's fractured dynamics. The manila folder in her hands contained documents she'd never intended to share: David's financial records, FBI contact information, legal precedents for fraud cases that painted increasingly grim pictures. Her knock was answered immediately, as if Amanda had been watching from the window. "I called David and Brian," Jennifer said without preamble. "We need to talk. All of us. Together." Amanda's expression remained neutral, but she stepped aside to let Jennifer enter. "Brian's already here. He's been working in the garage for the past hour. Apparently my tools are better suited for detail work than his studio equipment." They found Brian carefully polishing chrome on the '69 Boss 429, his artistic sensibilities evident in the methodical way he worked each surface to mirror perfection. He looked up when they entered, his face reflecting the same tension Jennifer felt. "David's coming," he said simply. "Took some convincing, but he's coming." The sound of tires on gravel announced David's arrival 15 minutes later. Jennifer watched through the garage's side window as her brother sat in his BMW for several minutes, his hands gripping the steering wheel, as if preparing for physical combat. When he finally emerged, his usual commanding presence was gone, replaced by the hollow-eyed exhaustion of someone facing personal catastrophe. "Mom," he said quietly as he entered the garage, his voice carrying none of the morning's aggressive certainty. "I owe you an apology." Amanda remained seated on her rolling stool, tools arranged neatly within reach, her expression unreadable. "You owe me an explanation first. Apologies without understanding are just words." David's composure cracked slightly. "Marcus, my business partner, he's been embezzling from the practice for years. $700,000, maybe more. The FBI thinks I might have been involved." The words came out in a rush, as if speaking them quickly would reduce their impact. "I'm facing criminal charges, civil lawsuits, loss of my medical license. Everything I've worked for is gone." The garage fell silent except for the distant rumble of evening traffic. Jennifer watched her mother's face, noting the subtle shift from defensive wariness to protective concern that had characterized Amanda's responses to her children's crises for 4 decades. "When did you find out?" Amanda asked. 3 weeks ago. The accountants called it in to authorities, and everything started unraveling." David's voice grew quieter with each admission. "This morning, when we came here talking about responsibility and making smart choices, I was watching my entire life collapse and couldn't handle seeing you making what I thought were irresponsible decisions. So you decided to fix me instead of dealing with your own problems," Amanda observed without judgment, simply stating fact. "I decided to control what I could because everything else was spinning out of control." David met his mother's gaze for the first time since entering. "I'm sorry, Mom. For the things I said, for the way I said them, for treating your passion like it was some kind of disorder that needed curing." Jennifer opened her folder, spreading documents across Amanda's workbench. "I've been researching David's case. Federal fraud prosecutions have a 93% conviction rate, but most of those involve defendants who actually committed crimes. The problem is proving David's innocence rather than Marcus's guilt." Brian looked up from his polishing work. "What kind of proof?" "Character witnesses, financial records showing David's legitimate income sources, evidence of his surprise when the fraud was discovered." Jennifer's legal training took over, providing structure to chaos. But the strongest defense would be demonstrating that David had no motive, that he wasn't under financial pressure that would make fraud attractive. David laughed bitterly. "Except I was under financial pressure. The practice expenses, the house payments, college funds. I needed every dollar Marcus was stealing." "That's actually helpful," Jennifer continued. "It shows you were living within your legitimate means, not funding an extravagant lifestyle that would require criminal income." Amanda had been listening quietly, her gaze moving between her children as they discussed David's crisis with the same analytical intensity they'd applied to her problems that morning. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a quality they'd rarely heard, the tone of someone who possessed information that could change everything. "Jennifer, you mentioned that demonstrating David's financial stability would help his case. What if he had access to significant legitimate assets that could resolve his debt situation?" "That would be ideal, but David's assets are frozen or mortgaged. Unless there's something we don't know about." Jennifer stopped mid-sentence, seeing something in her mother's expression that made her legal instincts activate. "Mom, what aren't you telling us?" Amanda stood slowly, moving to the Shelby's driver door and running her hand along the pristine chrome handle. "This afternoon I had a visitor. Chuck Patterson, a collector from the Gulf Coast Classic Car Association. He came to evaluate my collection." David's impatience surfaced, despite his contrition. "Mom, I appreciate whatever distraction you're offering, but I don't see how car appraisals help." "He offered $500,000 for the Shelby," Amanda interrupted quietly. The garage fell completely silent. Jennifer's legal document seemed to freeze in her hands, while Brian's polishing cloth stopped mid-motion. David stared at his mother, as if she'd spoken in a foreign language. 500,000, Jennifer repeated slowly. For one car. For one car. He estimated the entire collection at over $1 million. Amanda's voice remained steady, but her eyes held a mixture of sadness and irony that cut through her children's shock. So this morning, when you were lecturing me about making responsible financial decisions and disposing of worthless junk, you were actually discussing assets worth more than most people's retirement savings. Quote, David sank onto a nearby stool, his face cycling through disbelief, realization, and something approaching despair. $1 million. Jesus, Mom, why didn't you tell us? Because you never asked about value. You assumed worthlessness. Because you arrived with solutions already prepared, instead of questions about my actual situation. Amanda's response carried the weight of 5 years of accumulated disappointment. Because you saw an elderly woman playing with old cars instead of a collector maintaining significant assets. Brian set down his polishing cloth, his artistic sensibilities processing the emotional complexity of the revelation. We came here to fix you, and you were never broken. We lectured you about financial responsibility while you were sitting on a fortune. A fortune built over 40 years of careful acquisition, expert restoration, and passionate maintenance, Amanda corrected. Not inherited, not stumbled upon, earned through knowledge, skill, and dedication to something larger than immediate gratification. Jennifer's legal mind was already calculating possibilities. $500,000 would cover David's debt, with money left over for legal fees. It would remove the financial motive that makes him vulnerable to prosecution. It would save everything, David said quietly, his voice carrying wonder and shame in equal measure. But Mom, I can't ask you to. You can't ask because you spent the morning trying to force me to do exactly what you now desperately need, Amanda interrupted. You wanted me to sell my collection and abandon my passion. Now you need me to sell my collection to save your career. The parallel was devastating in its precision. David had demanded that his mother sacrifice what mattered most to her, never suspecting that her sacrifice might become his salvation. The reversal of power dynamics was complete. The family member they'd tried to manage now held the key to everything they'd built. I won't make the same mistake you made this morning, Amanda continued, her voice gaining strength. I won't make decisions for other people without understanding what those decisions really mean. David, tell me exactly what you need. Jennifer, tell me exactly what this investigation means for our family. Brian, tell me exactly how you think we should handle this situation. For the first time in years, Amanda's children found themselves being treated as adults whose opinions mattered, whose choices deserved respect, whose problems required collaborative solutions rather than unilateral management. I need $400,000 to settle the debt and avoid criminal charges, David said finally. I need character witnesses who can testify to my integrity. I need to rebuild a practice and a reputation from nothing. I need to decide between taking the New York position or staying to help David through the legal process. Jennifer added, I need to balance career advancement with family responsibility. I need to figure out how to preserve family relationships that almost shattered this morning, Brian concluded. I need to understand how we became people who show up with ultimatums instead of questions. Amanda nodded slowly, processing their needs with the same careful attention she'd applied to restoration projects for decades. Those are honest answers. Now let me give you one. I'm willing to sell the Shelby to Chuck Patterson, but not as a rescue operation that preserves everyone's pride while solving everyone's problems. If I make this sacrifice, it's because we commit to rebuilding our family with the same care Robert and I put into rebuilding cars, attention to detail, respect for original value, and patience with the process. The garage fell quiet as her children absorbed the magnitude of what she was offering and what she was demanding in return. Amanda's proposal wasn't just about money. It was about transformation, about changing how they related to each other and what they valued as a family. The question, Amanda said finally, is whether you want my help badly enough to earn it. Amanda retreated to her garage alone as her children sat in the living room, processing the magnitude of her offer and its conditions. The familiar sanctuary felt different now, charged with the weight of a decision that would reshape everything she'd built with Robert. She moved slowly between the cars, her fingers trailing along surfaces that held 40 years of shared memories. The Shelby stood in the center of the space like an altar, its Wimbledon white paint reflecting the overhead lights with the depth that only hand-polished perfection could achieve. Amanda opened the driver's door and slid into the leather seat that still held the subtle indentation of Robert's body, still carried the faint scent of his cologne mixed with motor oil and determination. Her hands found the steering wheel and suddenly she was 25 again, pregnant with David, watching Robert's patient hands guide hers as he taught her to feel the car's responses through the wheel. "A car tells you everything you need to know," his voice whispered across the decades. "You just have to listen with your whole body, not just your mind." She'd learned to listen that way, to engines, to transmissions, to the subtle vibrations that indicated problems before they became failures. But she'd also learned to listen to silences, to the spaces between words where truth lived in family conversations. Amanda reached into the glove compartment and retrieved the leather notebook she'd found weeks after Robert's funeral. His careful handwriting filled every page, but tonight she turned to the final entry, words written during his last week, when pain medication made writing difficult, but he'd insisted on finishing what he'd started. "Amanda," the shaky letters began, "if you're reading this, I'm gone, and you're trying to figure out what comes next. Don't let the cars become a shrine to my memory. They were never about the past. They were about the future we were building together, the legacy we wanted to leave for our children." Amanda's eyes filled as she continued reading words she'd memorized but never fully understood until tonight. "I know David thinks we wasted money on toys instead of saving for their inheritances. I know Jennifer thinks we should have focused on practical investments. I know Brian understands but feels guilty about understanding. They're all wrong, and they're all right. We did build something valuable, but its worth isn't measured in dollars. It's measured in the values we demonstrated: patience, craftsmanship, the belief that beautiful things deserve preservation." The notebook trembled in Amanda's hands as Robert's wisdom reached across 5 years of grief and loneliness. "But Amanda, if our children ever need what we built more than they need the lesson of building it, don't hesitate. Family is the only collection that really matters. The cars were always just our way of teaching them about dedication, about seeing potential in things that others had given up on. If they need saving, save them. The cars have already served their highest purpose. They brought us joy together." Amanda closed the notebook and sat in silence, listening to the garage's familiar sounds. The refrigerator's steady hum, the settling of metal as temperatures equalized, the distant whisper of traffic on Heights Boulevard. But underneath those sounds, she heard something else. Robert's voice, not in memory, but in the present moment, speaking truth she'd been afraid to acknowledge. Keeping the Shelby wouldn't preserve their love. It would transform it into something static, a museum piece that honored the past while ignoring the present. Robert had never been static. He'd been movement and growth, and the generous wisdom that saw potential in broken things. Like their family. Like David's shattered pride, and Jennifer's impossible choices, and Brian's artistic sensitivity that made him feel responsible for everyone's pain. Footsteps on the garage's concrete floor interrupted her reverie. Maggie Thompson appeared in the doorway, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the expression of someone who'd been watching and waiting for the right moment to intrude. "Figured you might need this," Maggie said, settling onto a nearby stool with the ease of long friendship. "Rough day for family meetings." Amanda accepted the coffee gratefully. "Chuck Patterson's offer. You knew what it would mean when you suggested he visit. I knew you needed to understand what you really possessed. I also knew your children needed to understand it." Maggie's weathered face held the wisdom of someone who'd fought similar battles in different arenas. "But I didn't know it would coincide with David's crisis." "Timing," Amanda said softly. "Robert always said timing was everything in restoration work. You can't force solutions. You have to wait for the right moment when all the pieces align." They sat in comfortable silence, 2 women who'd learned that friendship sometimes meant simply witnessing difficult decisions without trying to influence their outcome. "What would Robert want you to do?" Maggie asked finally. Amanda smiled through her tears. The answer clear for the first time since Chuck's visit. He'd want me to choose love over sentiment. He'd want me to save our children instead of preserving our cars. He'd want me to trust that the values we built together are strong enough to survive the sale of the objects that embodied them. She stood slowly, her decision crystallizing with each movement. The Shelby would go to Chuck Patterson, where it would be displayed and celebrated and allowed to inspire new generations of enthusiasts. David would get his second chance, Jennifer would find balance between ambition and family, and Brian would see that sometimes the most artistic act is knowing when to let go. But Amanda's conditions remained. This sacrifice would rebuild their family with the same attention to detail that had restored their cars. No shortcuts, no surface fixes, no pretending that problems didn't exist beneath perfect paint. She walked back toward the house, leaving the garage lights on for the first time in months. Tomorrow, she would call Chuck Patterson and begin the process of letting go. Tonight she would tell her children that love sometimes requires the courage to transform rather than preserve. The Shelby sat in its perfect restoration, ready for its next chapter. Like the family that had created it, the car would survive by evolving, by serving new purposes, while honoring the values that had shaped its existence. Chuck Patterson arrived the next morning, with the punctuality of someone who understood that serious negotiations required serious preparation. Amanda watched from her kitchen window as he emerged from his Camaro carrying a leather briefcase and wearing the focused expression of a collector about to acquire something extraordinary. But when Chuck entered the garage, he found more than he'd expected. Amanda's 3 children stood among the cars like sentries, their presence transforming what should have been a simple transaction into something more complex. David's hollow-eyed exhaustion was evident even to a stranger, while Jennifer's legal training showed in the way she positioned herself to observe without interfering. Brian continued his methodical polishing work, but his attention was clearly focused on the conversation about to unfold. "Mr. Patterson," Amanda said, her voice carrying the formal tone she'd perfected during decades of managing difficult library patrons. "I believe you mentioned an interest in acquiring the Shelby." Chuck's experienced eye took in the family dynamics immediately. "Mrs. Smith, I did indeed, though I suspect circumstances have changed since our conversation yesterday." "Circumstances have clarified," Amanda corrected. "The Shelby is available for purchase but under specific conditions that go beyond the financial transaction." She gestured toward the car that had dominated the garage's center space for nearly 4 decades. In the morning light, the Wimbledon white paint seemed to glow with inner fire, every curve and line speaking to the thousands of hours Robert had invested in achieving perfection. "First condition," Amanda continued, her voice steady despite the emotional weight of what she was proposing. "Any public display of this vehicle must include appropriate acknowledgement of Robert Smith's restoration work. Not a small plate tucked away somewhere, but prominent recognition of the craftsmanship that created what you're purchasing." Chuck nodded immediately. "I plan to do that regardless. Robert's work deserves recognition. It's part of the car's provenance and value. Second condition, I retain the right to visit the car at shows and events. Not ownership, not control, but connection. This automobile represents 40 years of my life, Mr. Patterson. I'm willing to let it go, but not to disappear from its story entirely." David shifted uncomfortably, his businessman's instincts warning against negotiations that included emotional components. But Jennifer's legal experience told her their mother was establishing terms that protected both dignity and ongoing relationship, conditions that Chuck would respect or reveal himself as someone unworthy of Robert's legacy. Third condition, Amanda continued, her gaze moving to each of her children before returning to Chuck. The purchase price will be paid in certified funds within 48 hours. No financing contingencies, no extended negotiations, no opportunities for anyone to reconsider or complicate what needs to be a clean transaction. Chuck's expression shifted from collector's enthusiasm to genuine respect. "Mrs. Smith, those conditions are entirely reasonable. In fact, they demonstrate exactly why this car should be in public venues where people can appreciate both the vehicle and the values that created it." He opened his briefcase and withdrew documents that spoke to serious preparation. "I've had my attorney prepare a purchase agreement that includes authentication verification and title transfer procedures. The price remains $500,000, as discussed. The figure still carried the power to stun. Brian's polishing cloth paused mid-motion, while Jennifer calculated the implications for David's legal situation. But it was David himself who surprised everyone by stepping forward with questions that had nothing to do with money. "Mr. Patterson, can you tell us about your plans for the car? Where will it be shown? How will it be maintained? What kind of recognition will my father's work receive?" Chuck's response revealed depths Amanda hadn't expected. "Your father's restoration work represents the finest craftsmanship I've encountered in 30 years of collecting. I show at Pebble Beach, Amelia Island, the Greenwich Concourse, venues where automotive artistry is celebrated by people who understand what they're seeing. Robert's story will be told every time this car is displayed." "What story?" Brian asked, his artistic sensibilities engaged by the concept of narrative preservation. "The story of a man who saw potential in a forgotten muscle car and spent 3 years bringing it back to life with his wife's partnership and support. The story of how love can be expressed through shared passion, how patience and skill can create something that outlasts the people who created it." Chuck's voice carried genuine reverence. "This car isn't just a 1967 Shelby GT500. It's a testament to the kind of values that built the automotive culture we're all part of." Amanda felt tears threatening but held them back through sheer force of will. Chuck understood what her children were just beginning to grasp, that selling the Shelby wasn't about abandoning Robert's memory, but about allowing his work to achieve its full potential. "There's one more condition," Amanda said quietly. "This sale resolves my son's immediate financial crisis, but it doesn't resolve the family issues that created this situation. David, you need to understand that accepting this help means accepting that your mother's choices have value, even when you don't understand them." David's pride, the same pride that had nearly destroyed him through silence about his crisis, surfaced one final time. "Mom, I can't take your life's work to solve my problems." "You're not taking anything," Amanda replied firmly. "I'm choosing to give it. There's a difference. And learning that difference is part of rebuilding our relationship with the same care Robert and I put into rebuilding engines." Jennifer stepped forward, her legal training providing structure to emotional complexity. "David, accepting help gracefully is sometimes harder than giving it. But refusing help because of pride is what got you into this situation." "She's right," Brian added, setting down his polishing supplies and facing his brother directly. "Dad taught us that restoration means seeing potential in broken things. Maybe we're the broken things that need restoring." Chuck watched the family dynamics with the patient attention of someone who understood that the real negotiation wasn't about money or cars. It was about relationships that had been damaged by assumptions and miscommunication. When he finally spoke, his words carried weight beyond business considerations. "Mrs. Smith, I've been privileged to acquire many significant automobiles over the years, but I've never been part of a transaction that meant as much to the seller as this one clearly means to you. I'll be honored to serve as custodian of Robert's work, and I'll make sure the automotive community understands what they're seeing when they encounter this car." Amanda extended her hand, and Chuck shook it with the solemnity of someone sealing more than a commercial agreement. "When can we complete the transaction?" "This afternoon. My bank can provide certified funds, and my attorney can handle the title transfer." Chuck's business efficiency balanced his emotional understanding. "Mrs. Smith, you're making the right choice for the right reasons. Robert would be proud." As Chuck departed to arrange the financial details, Amanda's children remained in the garage, the reality of the morning's decisions settling around them like dust after renovation work. The Shelby still gleamed in its perfect restoration, but its meaning had shifted from possession to possibility, from memory to future. "Mom," David said quietly, his voice carrying humility that had been absent for years, "I don't know how to thank you. You thank me by rebuilding your practice with the same integrity Robert brought to restoration work," Amanda replied. "You thank me by remembering that solving problems requires understanding them first, not assuming solutions before asking questions." Jennifer's phone buzzed with another call from New York, but for the first time in years, career advancement felt less important than family restoration. "I'm going to tell them I need more time to decide. David's legal situation is going to require months of careful handling. And family comes first. Family comes first when family functions like family," Amanda corrected gently. Not when family members sacrifice their dreams to manage other people's crises. We solve David's problem together, but you make your own choices about your own future. Brian smiled for the first time since their morning confrontation the day before. So we're actually going to try functioning like a family, instead of a collection of people who share DNA and criticism? Amanda's answering smile carried hope that hadn't existed 24 hours earlier. We're going to try functioning like a restoration project, carefully, patiently, with respect for what we're working with and commitment to what we're trying to create. The Shelby sat in its final hours in Amanda's garage, 40 years of shared dreams preparing to transform into new dreams for new dreamers. But the values that had created it, patience, craftsmanship, the belief that beautiful things deserve preservation, would continue in the family that had learned to see potential in broken relationships. The morning of the transfer dawned gray and humid, typical Houston weather that made everything feel heavy with possibility and loss in equal measure. Amanda stood in her kitchen at 5 a.m., coffee cup warming her hands as she watched Chuck Patterson's truck and trailer arrive precisely on schedule. The sight of the enclosed transport trailer sent an unexpected jolt through her chest. The finality of machinery designed to carry dreams from one life to another. By 7 a.m., her children had assembled in the garage like mourners at a particularly complicated funeral. David arrived first, carrying himself with the careful posture of someone whose world had shifted overnight from catastrophe to salvation. Jennifer followed, having postponed her morning conference calls to witness what she now understood was a historic moment in their family's evolution. Brian brought his camera, his artistic sensibilities recognizing that some moments deserved more than memory. Chuck arrived with a photographer, a woman named Sarah, whose portfolio included documentation for major auction houses and private collections. Mrs. Smith, Chuck explained, Sarah specializes in automotive provenance photography. Her work ensures that Robert's restoration process becomes part of the permanent record. Amanda nodded approvingly. Robert had always been meticulous about documentation, understanding that craftsmanship without context lost half its meaning. Sarah's presence meant the story would survive the transaction. Before we begin the transfer, Amanda announced, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had thought deeply about ritual and meaning. I want each of you to take one final drive with me, separately. This car has been part of our family for 37 years. It deserves individual goodbyes. David looked startled. Mom, I haven't driven the Shelby since I was in college. Exactly why you need to drive it now, Amanda replied, dangling the keys with a gesture that brooked no argument. You first, David. We're going to have a conversation that's 30 years overdue. Amanda slid into the passenger seat with the ease of long familiarity, but David approached the driver's side like he was handling nitroglycerin. The Shelby's interior enveloped them in leather and carefully preserved authenticity. No modern concessions to comfort, just the pure experience of American muscle car engineering at its finest. Easy on the clutch, Amanda instructed as David started the engine. Feel how it engages. There's a sweet spot where everything connects. The first few blocks were tentative, David reacquainting himself with manual transmission and unassisted steering while Amanda provided gentle guidance. But as they reached the open stretch of Heights Boulevard, something shifted. The car's responses became smoother, David's movements more confident, and the tension between mother and son began dissolving into shared focus on mechanical harmony. I forgot how alive this feels, David admitted, his hands finding the natural grip points on the steering wheel. Modern cars are so isolated. You can't feel the road, can't sense what the engine is doing. Your father always said that driving should be a conversation between human and machine, Amanda replied, watching her son's face soften as muscle memory returned. He worried that you'd forgotten how to have that conversation. They drove in silence through the Heights neighborhood, past houses that had witnessed 4 decades of their family's evolution. David's medical training had taught him to compartmentalize emotion, but the Shelby's visceral demands, the need to coordinate clutch, throttle, and steering with precise timing, broke through his defensive barriers. Mom, I owe you more than an apology, he said finally, his voice thick with emotion he'd been suppressing for months. I've been so focused on controlling everything that I lost sight of what actually mattered. Yesterday, when you offered to sell the Shelby to save my practice, that wasn't just generosity. That was you choosing to love me more than I deserved. Amanda's hand found his shoulder as they stopped at a red light. David, love isn't about deserving. It's about seeing potential in people even when they can't see it themselves. You made mistakes, but you're not a mistake. Your father would want you to remember that. The drive with Jennifer proved different, more analytical, with her daughter asking technical questions about the car's specifications while processing the emotional complexity of their family's transformation. Jennifer's legal mind found comfort in understanding systems, whether judicial or mechanical. I kept thinking about the New York position, Jennifer confessed as they navigated through downtown traffic. Part of me wondered if this crisis was convenient timing, a reason to avoid making hard choices about my own career. And what did you conclude? Amanda asked, noting how naturally Jennifer handled the Shelby's challenging parking requirements. I concluded that running toward opportunities is different from running away from responsibilities. I'm going to take the position, but with the understanding that family connections don't end at state borders. Jennifer's voice carried the confidence of someone who had found clarity through difficult analysis. Modern technology makes it possible to support David's legal situation from New York while building my own career. Amanda smiled, recognizing her daughter's gift for finding solutions that honored multiple priorities simultaneously. Your father would approve. He always believed that the best restoration work required understanding how all the parts worked together, not just focusing on individual components. Brian's drive became an exploration of artistic possibility. He took photographs from the passenger seat while Amanda handled the driving, capturing angles and details that revealed the Shelby's sculptural qualities. His aesthetic sensibilities found inspiration in the car's purposeful design, every line serving both function and beauty. I want to create something that captures what this means, Brian said, lowering his camera as they paused in a tree-shaded parking area. Not just the car, but the relationship between you and Dad, the way craftsmanship becomes love when it's shared. What did you have in mind? Amanda asked, intrigued by her youngest son's creative vision. A sculpture that incorporates actual parts from your collection. Not valuable components, but pieces that carry memory. Gaskets Dad's hands touched, bolts you turn together, fragments that tell the story of partnership. Brian's enthusiasm grew as he described his concept. It would be installed here in the garage, a permanent reminder of what you built together. Amanda felt tears threatening for the first time that morning. Brian had inherited Robert's understanding that art and craft existed on the same continuum, that both required patience, skill, and the willingness to see beauty in functional objects. When they returned to the garage, Chuck and Sarah had prepared a complete documentation station. The photographer captured every angle of the Shelby, while Chuck reviewed paperwork with the meticulous attention of someone who understood that proper documentation protected both buyer and seller. Mrs. Smith, Sarah said, adjusting her lighting equipment, I'd like to photograph you with the car, not as a final owner portrait, but as documentation of the restoration team. You and Robert created this together, and that partnership should be part of the permanent record. Amanda positioned herself beside the driver's door, her hand resting on the chrome handles she'd polished countless times over the decades. Sarah's camera captured not just image but context. The tools visible in the background, the other vehicles that spoke to serious collecting, the organized workspace that revealed professional-level expertise. Now with your children, Sarah suggested. This transaction represents more than a sale. It's a family choosing evolution over preservation. The family portrait felt surreal. Amanda, David, Jennifer, and Brian arranged around the Shelby like they were celebrating rather than saying goodbye. But as Sarah's camera clicked, Amanda realized that celebration was exactly what this moment deserved. They weren't losing something precious. They were transforming it into something that could serve broader purposes. Chuck handled the financial transaction with appropriate solemnity, presenting certified bank checks that represented more money than most people saw in years of work. But his attention remained focused on the car itself, on ensuring that every detail of the transfer preserved the integrity of Robert's craftsmanship. The title transfer is complete, Chuck announced, presenting Amanda with documents that formally ended her ownership of the Shelby. But Mrs. Smith, I want you to understand that you're not losing this car. You're sharing it with a community that will appreciate what you and Robert accomplished. As Chuck's crew loaded the Shelby onto the transport trailer, Amanda's family gathered around her with the instinctive protectiveness that crisis had restored to their relationships. The car disappeared into the enclosed trailer with mechanical efficiency, but its absence left a space that somehow felt larger than the physical dimensions it had occupied. David stepped forward as Chuck prepared to depart, extending an envelope toward Amanda. "Mom, I know you said this money is for my debt, but I want you to keep some of it. For whatever comes next in your life." Amanda shook her head firmly. "David, this money serves its purpose by solving your problem. What comes next in my life isn't about money. It's about understanding that letting go can be the beginning of something new rather than the end of something precious." Chuck's truck pulled away slowly, carrying 40 years of shared dreams toward an uncertain but promising future. Amanda watched until the trailer disappeared around the corner, then turned back toward her garage, where space waited for new projects, new possibilities, new expressions of the values Robert had taught her. "What now, Mom?" Jennifer asked, her arms sliding around Amanda's shoulders. Amanda smiled, feeling lighter than she had in months despite the magnitude of what she'd just released. "Now we find out what kind of family we can become when we stop trying to manage each other and start trying to understand each other." The garage felt different with the Shelby gone. Not empty, but expectant. Like a canvas waiting for new art, or a story ready for its next chapter. 6 months later, Amanda stood at the edge of the Keels and Wheels Concours d'Elegance at Lakewood Yacht Club, watching Chuck Patterson guide visitors around the pristine 1967 Shelby GT500 that had once dominated her garage. The October air carried the crisp promise of Houston's brief autumn, and the car show buzzed with the particular energy that came from passionate people sharing their obsessions with appreciative audiences. The brass plaque mounted beside the Shelby caught the morning sunlight. Restored by Robert and Amanda Smith, Houston, Texas, 1987 to 1990. This vehicle represents 40 years of dedication to automotive craftsmanship and the preservation of American muscle car heritage. Below that, in smaller text, "On loan from the Patterson Collection, displayed in honor of those who understand that restoration is an act of love." Amanda approached slowly, noting how Chuck had positioned the car to showcase both its mechanical excellence and its emotional significance. Visitors gathered around as he explained the restoration process, his voice carrying the reverence she'd come to expect from serious collectors who understood the difference between acquisition and stewardship. "Mrs. Smith!" Chuck's face lit up as he spotted her in the crowd. "Perfect timing. I was just telling folks about Robert's approach to engine bay detailing." The small crowd turned toward Amanda, with the respectful attention reserved for acknowledged experts. She found herself stepping forward naturally, her voice carrying the authority of decades spent working with these machines. "Robert always said the engine bay was like a painting. Every component had to serve both function and beauty," she explained, pointing to details that casual observers might miss. "See how the wiring follows the natural lines of the frame? How the air cleaner positioning balances the visual weight of the valve covers. Nothing was arbitrary." An elderly man in the crowd leaned closer, his eyes bright with enthusiasm. "Ma'am, I've got a '69 Boss 302 that needs restoration guidance. Would you be willing to take a look?" Amanda hesitated for only a moment before nodding. "I'd be happy to. Bring some photographs to Thompson Classic Restorations on Heights Boulevard. That's where I consult these days." As the crowd dispersed, Chuck smiled with genuine warmth. "You're becoming quite the celebrity in our community. Maggie tells me you're booked solid through the spring." Amanda's new consulting business had evolved organically from the connections Chuck had facilitated. Word spread quickly in the vintage car community when someone with her expertise became available, and she discovered an unexpected joy in helping other enthusiasts navigate the complexities of authentic restoration. "It's satisfying work," Amanda admitted, running her hand along the Shelby's fender with the familiarity of long relationship. "Different from doing the restoration myself, but meaningful in its own way." The sound of familiar laughter drew her attention across the display area. David approached with his teenage daughter Emma, both of them wearing the slightly overwhelmed expressions of people encountering serious car culture for the first time. "Grandma Amanda!" Emma called out, using the name that had evolved naturally as their relationship deepened over the past months. "Dad says this used to live in your garage?" "For 37 years," Amanda confirmed, noting how David's face had lost the hollow exhaustion that had characterized his appearance during the crisis. His practice was rebuilding slowly but steadily, his reputation recovering as the FBI investigation had concluded, with Marcus's arrest and David's complete exoneration. "Emma's applying to engineering programs," David said, his voice carrying the pride of a father watching his daughter discover her own path. "She wants to understand how restoration work applies to modern automotive technology." Amanda felt a familiar warmth in her chest, the satisfaction of seeing potential recognized and nurtured. "Emma, there's a lot more science in this work than most people realize. Metallurgy, chemistry, physics, electronics, restoration touches every engineering discipline." As they talked, Amanda noticed Brian approaching with a camera and notebook, documenting the car show for the multimedia project that had become his most ambitious work yet. His sculpture combining automotive components with family photographs now held a place of honor in Amanda's garage, but his vision had expanded beyond single pieces into comprehensive storytelling. "Mom, the documentary crew wants to interview you about the restoration philosophy," Brian said, gesturing toward a small film team setting up equipment nearby. "They're particularly interested in how you're passing knowledge to the next generation." Quote, the documentary had begun as Brian's personal project, but had attracted attention from automotive media outlets intrigued by the story of a widow who'd transformed personal loss into community resource. Amanda's expertise, combined with her family's dramatic crisis and resolution, created a narrative that resonated beyond car culture into broader themes about preserving tradition while embracing change. Jennifer appeared as if summoned by family gathering, her confidence radiating the satisfaction of someone who'd found balance between competing priorities. The New York position had exceeded her expectations, providing exactly the international corporate law experience she'd sought, while allowing her to support David's legal recovery through strategic advice and professional connections. "The Times wants to do a follow-up story," Jennifer announced, referring to the Houston Chronicle's coverage of their family's transformation. "Something about how crisis can restore relationships instead of destroying them." "Only if we control the narrative," Amanda replied, her librarian's instincts protective of family privacy despite growing public interest in their story. "Our experience belongs to us first, the community second." They gathered around the Shelby as Chuck continued fielding questions from visitors, but Amanda's attention drifted toward the broader implications of the moment. 6 months ago, she'd been a widow defending her passion against family pressure. Today, she was a respected expert sharing knowledge with enthusiasts who valued her contributions. The transformation hadn't been simple or painless. David's legal recovery had required months of careful rebuilding, both professional and personal. Jennifer's bi-coastal lifestyle demanded constant negotiation between career demands and family connections. Brian's artistic exploration of their story had forced all of them to confront uncomfortable truths about communication and assumption. But they'd learned to function as a restoration team rather than a collection of individuals pursuing separate agendas. Amanda's garage had become a weekly gathering place where they shared meals, compared notes on their respective projects, and maintained the kind of ongoing connection that sustained families through both crisis and success. "Mrs. Smith?" A young woman approached hesitantly, carrying a folder of photographs. "I'm Maria Gonzalez from Rice University's Mechanical Engineering program. Professor Chen said you might be willing to look at my senior project. It's about sustainable restoration practices for vintage vehicles." Amanda studied the young woman's earnest face, recognizing the same passionate curiosity that had driven her own learning decades earlier. "Maria, I'd be delighted to help. But first, tell me what you think sustainable restoration means." As Maria began explaining her research into environmentally responsible restoration techniques, Amanda caught David's eye and saw him smile with the warmth of someone watching family traditions pass to new generations. The circle was expanding beyond their immediate family, into a community of people who understood that preservation required evolution. The afternoon sun began its descent toward the Houston skyline as the car show entered its final hours. Chuck approached Amanda with the keys to the Shelby, a tradition they'd established for these events. "Would you like to take her for a drive?" he asked, knowing the answer but respecting the ritual they'd created. Amanda slid behind the wheel that still fit her hands perfectly, feeling the familiar weight of the steering and the precise engagement of the clutch. But this time, instead of driving alone with memories, she was surrounded by family members who understood what they were witnessing. Not the end of something precious, but its transformation into something that could serve broader purposes. As they drove slowly through the showgrounds, Amanda realized that Robert's voice had evolved from memory into wisdom that lived in her choices rather than her possessions. The cars he'd taught her to restore had been lessons in patience, craftsmanship, and the belief that beautiful things deserved preservation. But the most important lesson had been about recognizing when preservation required letting go. "What's next, Mom?" Jennifer asked from the passenger seat, using the phone call that had become their weekly tradition despite the distance between Houston and New York. Amanda smiled, watching Brian document other families sharing automotive passion, while David explained restoration concepts to Emma with growing confidence. "Next, we keep building. We keep learning. We keep finding ways to turn individual passion into community benefit." The Shelby responded to her guidance with the mechanical poetry that had first captured her imagination 47 years earlier. But now, instead of representing the past she was trying to preserve, it represented the future she was helping to create. One where knowledge flowed between generations, where crisis became opportunity for growth, and where families learned to function as restoration teams working on the most important project of all, each other. As the sun set over the car show, painting the sky in shades that matched the Shelby's chrome, Amanda understood that she'd finally mastered Robert's most important lesson. Sometimes the greatest act of love is knowing when to let go, trusting that what you've built together is strong enough to survive transformation and wise enough to find new ways to serve the world. The engine hummed with perfect timing as they headed home, carrying a family that had learned to appreciate both preservation and progress, both memory and possibility, both the past that had shaped them and the future they were building together. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us. Quote,